Hi, I'm Rebekah Modrak. I'm a professor at the Stamp School of Art and Design at the University of Michigan. And I'm here to talk about a new book that was just published with Disobedience Press called Trouble in Censorville, The Far Right's Assault on Public Education and the Teachers Who Are Fighting Back. And I'm happy to be joined today by a librarian and a teacher who are contributors to the book and can talk about their experiences a little. The book came about because during the pandemic, my daughter was a journalism student in high school, and she was assigned to the school board meetings in our district. And after one or two meetings, she came in and she said, "Mom, you have to come in and watch these meetings with me. You're not going to believe this." And I went in, and this was during public commentary. Parents were virtually lined up to make comments. And it was the first time that I had started to hear language about teachers. They were being referred to as public servants. Parents were saying, my tax dollar money is going to fund these public schools, so therefore I should have a say in what's happening in the classrooms. And I should be able to say that teachers should be in the classrooms, not teaching virtually, even before they're vaccinated. And parents who are in my district, mostly Democratic, were saying, I'm liberal, I'm a Democrat, I'm pro-union, and yet can we please shut the union up because they're prohibiting teachers from being in the classroom. So I was really surprised at a lot of the language I was hearing. It seemed to conflate the ideals of public education, which is, education for everybody, with the private school education, which is really like consumer driven. And I wrote an essay about the analysis of the parents' rhetoric and comparing it with some of the language that we are hearing nationally. And I sent it around to some faculty at different universities. And one of them was Nadine Callan, who's a professor at the University of North Texas. So Nadine wrote to me and said, "Can we have a conversation about, what you're observing here?" And when we spoke, Nadine, who teaches teachers to be teachers, had just had a student graduate, was bright and shiny, heading off to teach in a new district, moved to this district and in a wealthy suburb. And 4 days after they were there as a teacher, they were put on leave because they wore button-up shirts like I'm wearing today and pants in a district where almost all of the other teachers wore dresses. All of the other teachers wore dresses and heels. And so the parents were accusing this teacher of talking about gender in the class, in her elementary school class, arts class, which wasn't the case, and then accusing them of other things that also weren't accurate. And this teacher said to us, the one thing I would really like is to tell my story about what's happening. And so we met with them, we interviewed them or listened to them really, and then started to work with them to write their story. And it just grew. The teachers heard about this and asked if they also could tell their story. We reached out to some teachers, and we started to hear a lot of common themes between all of these stories, such as administrators who surprisingly should have been there to support teachers, instead were teaching teachers kind of like the enemy, and not trusting them, parents not trusting teachers and librarians' authority and expertise from their training. Students who really wanted to have access to ideas and information and critical thought and were prevented from having this access. And sort of the list goes on in terms of the things that we're hearing. I guess I would say that one other thing that was really important to me in telling all of these stories, and there's 14 stories in this book, is that oftentimes in the news, you might hear a little bit about what happened in someone's classroom. For example, they had a Black Lives Matter sign up in their classroom and a parent objected, and the next thing you know, the teacher was fired. But you don't hear about the fallout to teachers. You don't hear about the panic attacks, the weight loss, the weight gain, the having to go on medication for depression, the impact to their lives and to their psyches, their trust in the institution, their trust in their colleagues, their relationships with their colleagues, all of the kind of ripple waves of impact that we found when we did these in-depth conversations with teachers and librarians, that what we heard about and those were really important to us in telling these stories. So I'm happy today to introduce to you Gavin Downing, who's a high school librarian outside of Seattle in the state of Washington. And Gavin, thank you for being here.
I'm happy to be here. And I am currently a high school librarian. At the time of the story that is in the book, I was a middle school librarian, teaching 7th and 8th grade. And I had selected, I was growing the LGBTQ collection that year. One of the books that I had taken a very close look at was one called Jack of Hearts and Other Parts by Lev Rosen. And it's one that I probably wouldn't have selected if I didn't have 8th graders there, just because it does deal with some concepts that most 7th graders aren't dealing with. It just wouldn't be relevant. And it wasn't even right for all 8th graders, but I knew that for the right 8th grader, this book could save a life. And for the wrong 8th grader, it sits on the shelf for other people to read, to just be passed by. My principal found the book, decided she did not like it, tried to remove it, didn't want to follow the processes for book bans or challenges, started pulling other books as well, started contacting other principals in the district and telling them to start pulling books they didn't like. And when I, tried to tell her this is the process, I went to the district, this is the process. I had my union support, thankfully. The district ignored us. And so we eventually, I whistle blew. There was an article in Book Riot, there was an article in the Seattle Times, and things very abruptly changed. We technically had a formal challenge that came from a parent who did not have any children at the school. And my principal had her finger on the scale for the whole challenge, but we still managed to keep the book on the shelf. But it did take 6 months. And in those 6 months, I had a very hostile working environment. I had teachers sharing snippets of the book out of context in department meetings to try to get people riled up. I had people looking for reasons and excuses to write me up and get me in trouble. There was nothing that came of any of it, thankfully, but I had to be on guard constantly. People just glaring at me for no reason when I stepped into the office, that kind of thing. It was, and of course I had threats. There was a threat that mentioned my wife by name on a phone call, blocked, unfortunately, so I don't know who it was. It was very difficult. I had panic attacks. I would wake up in the middle of the night, terrified of going back to work the next day. I went through all of my sick time in those 6 months. And thankfully, I was able to transfer to another building in the district. My union supported me, had my back the whole time, which was great. And in the end, the books stayed on the shelves. And that was my experience. One of the other people in the book, of course, is Melissa Grandi Statz, and she's also here with us. Melissa, do you want to tell your story?
Yeah, thank you. Um, I am a fourth grade teacher in Burlington, Wisconsin, southeastern Wisconsin. I am still teaching fourth grade in the same district I was teaching in 4 years ago when my experience happened. Um, I am from Burlington. I moved there from Chicago when I was very young and grew up there, went to school in the district. I have three younger sisters who also went through the school district, and we all graduated from the public high school. My parents are very involved in the community. My dad was a city alderman for many, many years. So just a very well-known, respected family. And when I first started teaching in Burlington, it was right after the murder of George Floyd and right during COVID. I went back to school that fall. I had been home with my two sons at the time. I now have three, but I was a stay-at-home mom for a few years. I had been teaching in Chicago, and my family had moved back to Burlington to be closer to family, closer to grandparents. And I decided, like, after, all the social unrest that summer and COVID, that I really felt this need to be back in the classroom. And so a position opened up at one of the local elementary schools. I knew the principal. She knew I was looking for a job, or I was interested, and it happened to be a fourth grade position, which I had just been teaching when I was in Chicago. So it was kind of the perfect fit. My son was in preschool, pre-K, so he got to come to the school with me. So it all just really worked out great. And just a week or two into school, Jacob Blake was shot in Kenosha, which is very close to where we live. It's 30 or 40 minutes away. And so that week, a lot of kids were talking about it to themselves and, asking questions or just commenting on, a few had been to Kenosha for appointments and they saw boarded up building and with graffiti and things on them. And so they knew something was going on. And so I decided for a social studies lesson to talk about it. And I used the book, a kid's book about racism. And we just started the conversation just talking about what is racism, who experiences it, and just a general discussion. And kids were contributing and asking questions. Our community is a pretty conservative white community. It's small, about 12,000 people. And there were only a few students of color in my classroom. But the few students that were there were raising their hand, they were sharing their own experiences or, things that they had been called by other people or experiences family members had had. And the other kids in the class, the white kids, were really shocked by some of the things they heard. They were really supportive. Kids were upset for their friends. And so it was really very amazing to see the compassion and the empathy. And then we moved the conversation to the Black Lives Matter movement and protests. I found just a worksheet online the night before that kind of just gave an overview of how the Black Lives Matter movement began and why, and just general definition of what is a protest, why do people protest, and we just had this conversation on what they had been seeing all summer long. We had a few protests in our town, and just a discussion. And it was during COVID, so I had very small groups of students. We were broken up into small, pods of maybe 10 kids. So I taught the lesson 5 different times that day, and each conversation was different. Each conversation went in its own direction organically, and kids just shared what they knew, or they shared their questions. And it was really impactful. They left that day. I had one of the Black girls in my class thanked me for teaching them about racism, teaching the class about racism. One of the Black boys came and gave me a huge hug. And so you could tell it was really meaningful to the kids. And I left school thinking like, okay, this was a really good day. Like I just felt really positive about it. And then that evening, I got a phone call from my coworker telling me I needed to go on to Facebook because people had been posting about my lesson. And our community was kind of in uproar about what had happened. One of the kids brought the worksheet home. And so it wasn't even their parent, it was another adult, I think an uncle, saw it and posted it on a buy-sell trade group for our community and surrounding communities, and just said, this is the indoctrination happening at our elementary schools, and said my school by name. And people really went crazy. My administration spoke to me the next day about it, asking why, I chose this lesson. And I just explained that kids had questions and explained the purpose of the lesson, what we talked about. And I didn't necessarily get in trouble, but I also wasn't supported in my choice. They told me they wish I wouldn't have said the words Black Lives Matter, that it had become too political. And so they put out a statement to the district trying to calm things down to all the families, and used some really unfortunate wording, saying things like teachers are supposed to be unbiased and teachers are supposed to choose curriculum that shows both sides, and just a lot of offensive words. And so that actually got people even more riled up. I had a hate group started against me on Facebook where people just joined. It was called Parents Against a Rogue Teacher, and it was just trying to come up with ways to get me fired. They would post, things like that I'm a terrorist, I'm mentally abusing children, I'm a Marxist. They would post pictures of their guns and talk about what they could do to intimidate me and try to get me to leave my school. And it all kind of culminated with a school board meeting that was coming up where they were trying to rally people to come and speak against me and about why I should be fired. And throughout the whole thing, I also didn't feel a lot of support from my administration. I know that they were trying to play both sides and not go against me, but also not really support me. And so it was definitely really difficult. Like Gavin said, I think in the moment, I didn't realize how much it impacted me because I was just trying to survive and keep going and keep teaching. But even now, with the book coming out, I've been having nightmares about losing my job. And it's really showing me okay, there was a lot of trauma in this experience that is even coming back years later. And so I was advised by administration not to speak out, not to say anything to the parents, not to speak to reporters. And eventually I did speak to a reporter, and I'm really happy I did, because I felt like my administration wasn't supporting me. They weren't putting out a statement on my behalf. And so I spoke to a local reporter. He told my side of the story. And luckily at that school board meeting, I was able to get a lot of people there in support of me. So we had it was at least 2 hours of public comments, people going for and against what I did. And at the end, the school board said I wouldn't be fired for this. And I kind of hoped that it would be done there. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it was picked up by a lot of local news stations and then really kind of blew up from there. And I was starting to get hate from people all around. And it really there was an uptick in the harassment and a lot worse wording used, and a lot more threats coming to my family. And eventually I ended up having to go to the police. And at that point, I did reach out to my administrators and I said, I'm going to document this with the police because at this point, I'm worried something's going to happen to me or my family. And I want it to be known that you haven't done anything to support me. And so thankfully, after that, our superintendent put out a statement that really did support me and really supported our Black and Brown and our other students of color, and just saying that they regretted the choices that they used in the words in that first statement, and that Black and Brown lives do matter to our district, and really made a much stronger statement in support of me and just support of diversity and anti-racism, and just the importance of curriculum that addresses those things. So that really helped, and it calmed things down with families. I have continued to have issues. I have people constantly questioning everything I do. I'll have a pride flag in my classroom and people are upset, or I'll teach a lesson that makes people upset. So it's never ending. I mean, I just had an instance about a month ago. I am part of an anti-racism group in our town, and we host Juneteenth celebration every year. And so I was getting in trouble for a picture I was in at Juneteenth. So it's a never ending battle, but at least now I've been in the district longer, and parents have gotten the chance to get to know me, and their kids have loved being in my room. So I think now there's a more trust where I have a little more wiggle room and flexibility in my classroom, but it's definitely taken years, and there's still I'm so excited about the book and I want everyone to know about it. But then also I have this fear that, it's going to all start over again. So it's definitely a balance between doing the right thing and also, worrying about my own mental health and safety, and my kids, their safety as well. So.
Thanks, Melissa and Gavin. I mean, really what's at the heart of your stories is that you provided access to students for conversations and materials that were really meaningful for them. And Gavin, as you said, potentially life-changing or life-saving even. And, from the student perspective, that was one thing, these meaningful experiences. And then all of the kind of smoke and mirrors and uproar around it was really from outside of the school, from a community that doesn't really understand what those experiences are. Or even, I think, the training, Gavin, and in your essay, you talk a lot about, all of the work that goes into selecting a book, especially a book that does touch upon sensitive subjects, and all of the resources that you rely upon. And Melissa, the same with you. You talked a lot about how you made selections for materials. So Bob had asked a question about what can you do, what can parents and teachers do, and we do have at the end of the book, there's a 4-page guide with advice, and this is called from all of the stories. For example, for teachers, having school policy at the ready, printed out so that you can hand it to an administrator, and knowing all the policy, because a number of the librarians pointed out that most administrators don't even know their own policy. And then from a parent's perspective, I think reading these stories is one of the most important things, because once you do that, you have a sense of what a teacher and librarian's day-to-day life is like, and all of the work and expertise they bring to a classroom. And but I think being there, paying attention to what's happening in the classrooms, lending your voice when something happens, either to the administration or the school board, speaking at school board meetings, writing letters, all many, many ways that the community can help to support educators.